Welcome to Craft Podcast. Today's episode is a philosophical keynote, and the title is From Models to Frameworks, a reflective podcast session about complexity, human maturity, leadership, and what it means to navigate a world that is increasingly uncertain and constantly changing. My name is Jenny Bergh, and I'm the founder of this podcast where we explore leadership, coaching, learning, human development, and the deeper questions shaping our time. I'm grateful that you are here. I believe there is a tendency in our time that we need to begin with talking much more about what is our almost reflexive longing for models. We want models for our leadership, for our coaching, for our learning, for driving change and working with our culture and people in our organizations. It's not difficult to understand why. Models help us orient ourselves. They create language, they help us recognize patterns, and I want to make this clear from the very beginning. I'm not against models, not at all. I worked with models for many years. I teach them, I still use them, absolutely. The problem is not the models themselves. The problem begins when people start believing that human development can be reduced to models, or that we can understand the world through models. Because there comes a point where models begin to do something strange to the way we think. At first, they help us understand reality. But after a while, they risk replacing the reality, and we don't see the things we need to see. I believe a great deal of coaching, leadership, and organizational development today exists precisely in that space. I thought about this when I read Dave Snowden's phrase, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." That is actually a profoundly humble idea. All models are wrong. Not because they are bad, but because they describe only one perspective of reality. Because reality is always larger than our description of it. It contains more. And yet we often live as though the right model could produce the right person or the right script or organization, the right leadership, the right culture. But human beings do not work that way. And anyone who has worked with people long enough already know this. After many years in coaching and leadership development, I believe one of the most important distinctions you begin to understand is the difference between working methodologically and working maturely. And those are not the same thing. It is possible to be highly methodological without truly understanding people. It is also possible to be certified, structured, and technically skilled in methods without being able to meet complexity. This is where I believe the distinction between models and frameworks become crucial. A model attempts to describe reality. A framework helps us orient ourselves within reality, whatever it comes with. And that may sound subtle. It changes almost everything. Models often seek clarity. Frameworks help us navigate uncertainty. Models simplify, while frameworks hold complexity. Models attempt to create reproducibility. Frameworks attempt to develop judgment, discernment, and practical wisdom and maturity. And perhaps that is exactly why so many people today are highly educated, well-informed in so many ways, but I find them still struggling with feeling disoriented and lost in a world that is really ambiguity, in so many ways uncertain. I believe we've trained leaders and employees to use these tools, models, tools, but not always to think for themselves. We need to think for ourselves more, reflect more, definitely. We have trained people to follow processes, but we have not always helped them to understand the context or making sense of things. And sometimes we have confused competence with maturity. Those are not the same. And this has become increasingly clear to me through the recent conversations in the podcast that this is such an important topic. I've done 4 interviews and all of them have touched on this subject. I spoke with Tracy Sinclair in the episode of 188, and one of the underlying questions kept returning in our conversation. Because coaching is not merely a method for performance, it's not a model, and its core. It is work with human development. And human development is never fully linear. It is relational, it is alive, it is emergent. Emergent means that it gradually unfolds through the interaction of many parts, many things in a conversation, without being entirely planned or predictable from the beginning. And perhaps that is why the most transformative conversations rarely follow a model. They follow something deeper. They have presence. They have genuine listening. They have judgment. They have practical wisdom, something that Aristotle is talking about. Discernment. In my conversation with Laurie Schock, she also a coach with great experience. She expressed something similar from another angle. She said, transformation does not happen by fixing people's problems. It happens when people begin to see something new. I agree. When they see something about themselves, about how they interpret the world, about their relationships, and what is happening in the relationships in between people. And that cannot be fully standardized or understood through models. In fact, I think this is why so many people today feel exhausted by parts of the development industry. Too much of it sometimes feels produced, conceptualized, and manualized. The people I meet intuitively sense the difference between something that is alive and something that is merely reproduced and scaled. That is also why I'm becoming less and less interested in creating dependency on methods. That doesn't mean that I don't use methods. I do, but they are not in the forefront of my thinking. Increasingly interested in developing people's capacity to think for themselves. That's my interest. How can I help someone to think for themselves? To be having practical wisdom. For a long time, organizations were built around stability, predictability, control. And in those kinds of environments, models work reasonably well because you could predict what will happen. And then it's easy to simplify through models. But the world has changed. And it's reminding me of the conversation I had in the podcast 186 with Zubair Ahmed, as well as with Jan Tore Nygaard from Equinor. That is unfortunately in Norwegian and Swedish, but Zubair you will be able to listen to. Zubair is leadership developer at Telenor. We talked about how the world is uncertain and complex and how we tend to believe stability is normal, when in reality maybe the world is actually uncertainty, change and complexity. That's the norm. We have simply lived through an unusually long period in which many parts of the world experienced stability, safety and predictability. But now the world is returning to what is actually normal: seasons, variation, uncertainty, variety. We now live in a world with rapid change, complexity, uncertainty, constant movement. And in complexity, linear answers do not remain effective for very long. And this is what we often refer to as Barney or VUCA. You probably heard those. That is why Unifun is so important, because it helps us understand that different kinds of realities require different kinds of responses. In complexity, we cannot always analyze our way forward first and then act. We must instead try. We must experiment, observe, listen genuinely to the people around us and to the society, to the context. We need to have a learning attitude, and we need to adapt fast sometimes. And that requires something that is deeply human. It requires discernment, judgment, and practical wisdom. And I generally believe that discernment and practical wisdom will become one of the most important competencies of the future, especially in a time when artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly capable to analyze, structure, reproduce, and process information for us. Because if machines become better at following models, then human value becomes something else. Perhaps our value will be the ability to hold complexity, the ability to create meaning and meaningfulness, the ability to understand context, and the ability to meet people without reducing them to simple models. And that is precisely where frameworks become more important than methods. It's also why I see that Learn Coaching that we are working with as a framework rather than a method. It's not a method. It is a framework. It is skill. It is something you learn, deeply learn, because people do not simply need more techniques. Learn Coaching is not a technique. You need to rather develop reflection, awareness in your life, learning capacity, discernment, practical wisdom, and human maturity. Perhaps that is what the leadership of the future and the coaching of the future is truly about. I think so. Not having more answers, but being able to help people orient themselves in a world where the answers are constantly changing. In my work and life, I experience that people today are not longing for more models or methods. They are actually longing for something much deeper. What are they longing for then? Well, they long for meaning, orientation, or how should I orient in this world? They long for understanding, sense-making, and they long for humanity, empathy. And perhaps that is why certain conversations stays with us sometimes, not because they gave us more techniques or transactional action plans that helped us in any way or in some perspectives, but because they actually helped us to see reality in a new way, helped us to interact with the reality. They gave us a new perspective, gave us nourishment for our inner life, greater groundedness and deeper strength. Truly, great coaching and leadership are not about having the right model. I don't believe that. I believe a mature coach and leader has the ability to meet reality without first needing to reduce it. Perhaps that is exactly why frameworks work better than models. Not because they simplify the world, but because they help us remain present to what is still alive. I hope this podcast has given you not only new thoughts, but perhaps also a deeper sense of orientation in a complex world. Maybe the future is not primarily asking us for models, more models, faster answers, or greater control. Maybe it's actually asking us to become more human, more reflective, more present, more capable of holding complexity without reducing it too quickly. If this episode resonated with you, feel free to share it with someone you believe would appreciate the conversation. Thank you for being here with me, and until next time, take care, keep reflecting, and stay curious.